What if everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt was wrong? This isn't just a tomb. This is a sealed mystery that survived over 3,000 years. Two men step into a hidden chamber, dust in the air, silence everywhere. And then they see it. Walls covered in symbols no one fully understands. Figures frozen in time, watching, waiting. But here's the terrifying part. These carvings weren't just decoration. They were a warning, a message meant for anyone who dares to enter. Who were these people really trying to protect? And what were they so afraid of escaping? Because once this tomb was opened, nothing was ever the same again. And what they found inside still doesn't make sense, even today.
The boy king could not lift the crown without pain. It pressed against his head like a burden he had not chosen, heavy not because of gold, but because of everything it demanded from a child who had barely learned how to stand without trembling. The palace was silent that morning, yet it felt louder than a battlefield. Servants lowered their eyes, priests whispered behind pillars, and the young king, Tutankhamun, sat alone, trying not to let his hands shake. What if a king was crowned before he understood what it meant to be human? The days that followed did not feel like power. They felt like a slow drowning. Every sunrise brought decisions he did not understand, and every sunset carried the weight of consequences he could not escape. His body was fragile, his steps uneven, and yet the world expected him to walk like a god among men. The corridors of the temple stretched endlessly, their walls carved with stories of strong rulers, men who conquered, men who never hesitated. He walked beneath them like a question that no one wanted to answer.
Outside the palace, the land was restless. The people had grown tired. Years of confusion had shaken their faith. The temples had been abandoned, then restored, then abandoned again. Even the gods, it seemed, had been treated like passing thoughts. The people whispered in markets, in narrow streets, in homes lit by weak flames. They did not trust the silence of the palace, and they did not trust the voice of a boy king. Inside, the court was divided. Some saw him as hope. Others saw him as an opportunity. There was an old advisor, bent with age but sharp with memory. He spoke softly, never rushing his words. He would stand beside the young king and say, "Patience builds what strength cannot." But his voice was often drowned by others, men who spoke louder, men who promised quick power, quick control, quick glory. They smiled too easily. They bowed too deeply. Tutankhamun listened to both, and each choice felt like walking across a fragile bridge. What if the greatest danger is not the enemy outside, but the voices you choose to believe?
But at night, when the palace grew quiet, the truth returned. His legs burned with pain. His breath came short. The crown was gone, the gold removed, the eyes of others no longer watching. In those moments, he was not a king. He was just a boy, alone with a body that betrayed him and a world that demanded too much. What if power cannot protect you from yourself? There were moments when anger found him. He would hear of corruption in distant villages, of men using his name to take more than they should, of the poor growing poorer while the rich filled their homes with grain. His hands would tighten, his voice would rise, orders would be given quickly, punishments declared without patience. And for a brief moment, it felt like control. But control built on anger leaves cracks behind. The old advisor would return, standing quietly until the storm passed. A rushed hand, he would say, often builds a broken wall. But regret does not undo what has already been done. The
punished could not forget, the frightened could not trust. And slowly, the distance between the king and his people grew, not with rebellion, but with silence. What if injustice does not come from cruelty, but from fear? Time did not wait for him to grow stronger. The seasons passed.
Gold covered his face. Jewels surrounded his body. Chariots, statues, and countless objects filled the chambers of his tomb. It was a display of wealth, of status, of everything the world believed mattered. But the silence inside that tomb was deeper than any treasure. Years passed, then centuries. The world changed. Names were forgotten. Empires rose and fell. And still, he remained there, untouched, unseen, his story locked away in darkness. Until one day, the doors were opened. Strangers stepped into his resting place, their eyes wide with wonder. They saw the gold. They saw the beauty. They saw the greatness that had been preserved for thousands of years. But they did not see the boy who struggled to stand. They did not feel the weight of the crown that hurt his head. They did not hear the quiet nights, the unspoken fears, the choices that shaped a life.
What if even your name was not truly yours? He was born into a broken house. His father, Akhenaten, had turned his back on the old gods and built a new world under a single sun. Temples were closed, priests were silenced. The old ways were treated like dust to be swept away. But a kingdom does not forget so easily. Beneath the surface, anger grew quietly, like cracks forming in a wall no one was repairing. His mother, her identity faded into whispers. Some said she was a queen. Others said she was closer than that, bound by blood in a way that made the palace itself uneasy. Her face was never clearly remembered, only her absence. And so the boy grew up surrounded by power, yet touched by a strange loneliness that had no name. What if your family leaves you not with strength, but with unfinished battles? When he became king, he did not inherit peace. He inherited consequences. The temples his father had abandoned stood like empty shells across the land. Their walls, once filled with prayers, now echoed with silence. The people had lost more than faith. They had lost direction. And so, under the guidance of older men who stood behind him like shadows, the boy king made a choice.
There is a quiet kind of strength in showing up when everything inside you is breaking. Others in the palace began to shift. I, the older figure who had always been near, watched carefully. Horemheb, the general, stood firm but distant. They were patient men, shaped by time, not by struggle. And patience in such places often hides ambition. Tutankhamun may have been king, but he was not the strongest force in the room. What if power belongs not to the one who wears the crown, but to those who wait behind it? Still, he tried. He hunted when he could, rode chariots when his body allowed, stood before statues of gods and offered what he had, not because he believed he could fix everything, but because doing nothing would mean accepting the collapse. And somewhere, deep within him, there was still a boy who wanted to be enough. What if trying is the only victory some people are given? When he died, the world did not stop. There was no long mourning that changed the course of history. The palace moved quickly. Decisions were made.
I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe and turn on the notifications to watch more videos. Thanks for listening, and wait for our next video.